Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources and find the fascinating insights hidden within. Today we're embarking on a deep dive into, well, a really foundational text, an 1885 college textbook on political economy. It's rooted in John Stuart Mill's principles. Our mission is to really get inside the heads of economic thinkers from, over a century ago, uncover the core idea that shaped how they saw wealth in society, and see what surprising echoes or contrasts we find today.
Yeah, and this isn't just like dusting off an old book. It's a real lens into how fundamental economic concepts, the building blocks of how we think about markets, wealth, government, how they were defined and taught at a pivotal moment. We'll explore everything from how production works and value is created, to how wealth gets distributed and the very specific roles they saw for money, trade, and the state.
Okay, let's really dig in then. We've got this pretty dense text covering production, capital, value, money, wages, profits, rent, international trade, even taxation and debt. It feels like a whole system.
It is, exactly. And our job is to pull out those core principles, understand why the text emphasizes them, illustrate them with their specific examples, because the examples are really key to seeing their logic, and highlight areas where these historical views offer genuinely interesting insights or, make us ask questions about our own assumptions.
So where does it start? Production,
Yeah.
right? And it makes a very strong opening statement.
Uh-huh.
Industry is limited by capital, and increasing capital increases employment, seemingly without limit. That feels incredibly direct.
It does. And what's really fascinating here is their definition of capital itself. It's not just machines or money in the bank.
No.
No, it's defined fundamentally as the result of saving. It's abstinence from present consumption for a future good. The text really drives home that all capital, whether it's food for workers, raw materials, or machinery, is ultimately consumed in production.
Consumed, even like a machine. How does that work?
Yeah, well, in the sense that it wears out or becomes obsolete, or the materials it's made of get used up, sort of. But the key is it's kept up by perpetual reproduction. The text uses this powerful example of countries recovering from, say, devastating wars or fires.
Okay.
They show how, even after huge destruction, the capacity to produce is rebuilt surprisingly fast because people redirect resources they saved towards replacing that consumed capital. It really illustrates this idea of capital as a flow that needs constant replenishing through saving.
Okay, so saving isn't just about, personal wealth. It's the engine of productive capacity for the whole economy. And the book calls this impulse the effective desire of accumulation.
Right.
And this is where it gets really interesting. It sees this desire, this willingness to sacrifice now for future production as a fundamental test of civilization.
That's a core insight for them, definitely. They contrast, societies living hand to mouth with no future planning, with what they saw as civilized societies where production needs complex tools, buildings, materials, all demanding prior saving.
Even simple things.
Yeah, like building an oven or making a pinhead. These acts require capital that came from earlier saving. It's framed not just as economic behavior, but as a kind of societal marker of foresight and development.
And what motivates this saving? Is it just profit?
Well, the text acknowledges profit, of course, as a powerful driver, but it also highlights simply the willingness to make that sacrifice, that trade-off between present and future. And they point to real-world evidence they saw then. The huge growth in U.S. savings banks deposits in the late 19th century, they actually note an over 83% increase in national bank deposits between 71 and 83.
Wow.
Yeah, they cited that as tangible proof of this effective desire operating on a massive scale. Not just the rich, but ordinary people saving, contributing to the nation's capital.
Okay, they also make a really sharp distinction between different kinds of consumption, productive versus unproductive.
Right. Productive consumption is using things that help you make other things, like coal for baking bread, raw cotton for weaving cloth, that kind of thing.
Makes sense.
Unproductive consumption is consuming something purely for, immediate pleasure or gratification. A fancy coat, a ticket to the opera.
And the text notes that even the tailor making the fancy coat added wealth while he worked.
Exactly.
But the act of wearing the coat doesn't increase wealth later.
Precisely. The labor created wealth in the coat, but the consumption of the coat is like the end of the line for that item economically. The crucial distinction for the text is about the labor used to supply these two types. They use this thought experiment. Imagine half the labor force supplies stuff for productive consumption, tools, materials, and the other half supplies stuff for unproductive consumption, luxuries, entertainment.
Okay.
If the first half stops working, the country quickly gets impoverished because its ability to produce future goods just collapses.
Right.
But if the second half stops, well, there's less fun stuff around, but the fundamental productive capacity is still there. That's the difference they're highlighting.
So the real bottleneck isn't people not wanting to buy things, but the economy's physical ability to, well, make things.
That's exactly their argument. Demand alone doesn't create jobs or wealth. What creates them is capital directed towards production. Every increase in capital, they argue, benefits labor either more jobs or higher pay because it expands the resources available for workers.
And they illustrate this with that example of the farmer and the carpet weaver.
Yes, and a lumberman too. The point is that through specialization and using capital, these individuals produce way more of their specific good than if they tried to do everything themselves.
Uh-huh.
When they trade, supported by capital, they each end up with more total goods, more food, more carpets, more timber for the same amount of work. The text concludes that laborers overall get offered a larger sum of articles for their effort, which they see as basically getting higher real wages. It directly links capital accumulation to better living standards for labor.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about value. This is pretty fundamental, isn't it? The text distinguishes between value and price.
Right. Value is like general purchasing power, what a thing can command in exchange for other things. Price is just value expressed in money terms. And for something to even have value, it needs utility, got to be useful, or difficulty of attainment can't be free for the taking, and it has to be transferable.
Okay, so how is value determined? It seems they make a key distinction based on whether something can be, like, multiplied indefinitely.
Exactly. For commodities that can be multiplied without limit by labor and capital, think manufactured goods, clothes, furniture, their value, in the long run, comes down to their cost of production.
But specifically.
Specifically, the cost under the least favorable existing circumstances currently needed to meet demand. If demand for shirts goes up, maybe you have to use a less efficient factory or pay overtime. That increases the marginal cost.
And that marginal cost sets the value for all shirts.
That's the idea, yeah, for all the shirts in the market at that point.
And what about things with a fixed supply, like a rare painting or a unique piece of land?
Their value is purely supply and demand. Cost of production is irrelevant because, well, you can't make more of it. Simple as that.
Okay, here's something that sounds a bit tricky. Goods with joint costs, like gas and the coke left over from making gas. They're produced together. How does that work for value?
Yeah, that's a great example of how the system handles complexity. You have one total cost for producing both the gas and the coke. Their individual values aren't set by separate costs.
So how then?
It's the combined demand for both. The market value of the gas adjusts and the market value of the coke adjusts until the demand for each at those values is enough to sell all that's produced. And the sum of their values has to cover the total cost of making them jointly plus the normal profit. It shows how markets are kind of interconnected.
Money comes into play here too, obviously.
Well, money in this framework is seen as a vital tool, a contrivance, really, to make exchange easier. But it doesn't fundamentally change those underlying laws of value we just talked about, cost or supply demand. The text describes its three classic functions: common denominator for comparing values, medium of exchange to avoid straight barter, and a standard of value for contracts over time.
And they preferred gold and silver?
Yeah, because they naturally had useful properties. Portable, durable, divisible, and, importantly, relatively stable value over time compared to other things.
And the value of money itself, does that change?
Oh, yeah. Its value depends, like other limited commodities, on its quantity relative to the demand for it, and also the rapidity with which it circulates, how fast it changes hands. Now, in the long run, its value does tend towards the cost of producing the metal it's made from, but changes in mining costs take a very long time to significantly alter the total supply of gold or silver money.
And they mention Gresham's law. That's the bad money driving out good one.
That's the one. The text uses U.S. currency history between 1834 and 1873 as a perfect example. As the market values of gold and silver shifted relative to each other, one metal would become undervalued at the official mint ratio compared to its market price, and the other overvalued.
So people would.
People would use the overvalued, cheaper metal for everyday payments, and the undervalued, more valuable metal would be hoarded or melted down or exported. It effectively vanished from circulation. Bad money drove out the good.
The text also brings in credit. How does that fit?
Credit is seen mostly as a mechanism for transferring capital. It lets resources move from savers who are entrepreneurs to entrepreneurs who need capital. Bills of exchange are shown as this really sophisticated way credit helps trade, almost like a complex barter system over long distances.
They give that example of merchants in the U.S. and England trading debts.
Exactly. Merchant A in the U.S. owes B in England. C in England owes D in the U.S. Instead of shipping gold back and forth, A buys a bill of exchange from a U.S. banker promising payment in England, sends it to B. C buys a bill in England promising payment in the U.S., sends it to D.
And the bankers sort it out.
Yeah, the bankers act as intermediaries, settling the claims between themselves, drastically reducing the need for actual gold shipments. It makes international trade much more efficient.
But credit isn't always presented as a good thing, is it?
No, the text specifically warns about speculative credit, especially when it's fueled by too much currency being issued. Normal credit kind of rises and falls with real trade needs.
But speculative credit.
Speculative credit can inflate asset values and prices way beyond their sort of natural level, leading to these booms. But when the speculation bubble bursts, prices don't just go back to normal. They can crash below their usual level, causing a commercial revulsion, basically a crisis or panic.
And this ties back to the type of currency being used.
Absolutely. They draw a very clear line between convertible paper currency banknotes backed by gold, say, that you can swap for gold anytime, and inconvertible paper currency, like government paper money with no backing.
Convertible is limited.
Right. Its value is tied to the metal, which limits how much can be issued. Inconvertible paper, no such limit. The text calls the potential for unlimited depreciation with inconvertible paper an intolerable evil.
And they use the U.S. greenback experience during the Civil War as the cautionary tale.
It was their recent painful memory. The massive issue of unbacked greenbacks led directly to depreciation. They even point to a chart in the book showing the decline visually. This depreciation fueled speculation, made trade chaotic because contracts became uncertain, and led to dishonest practices like people paying off debts in cheap paper money. The text argues it really hurt the country's credit and honor, a real-world lesson in the dangers of unanchored currency.
Okay, so we've got production, value, money. How does the text explain how the wealth actually gets shared out? It tackles wages, profits, and rent. Let's start with wages.
Yeah, and this is interesting because the text really engages with and actually critiques some of the dominant ideas of its time. It specifically pushes back against the old wages fund theory.
That's the idea that there's a fixed pot of money for wages.
Exactly. A fixed amount of capital predetermined to be paid out as wages, meaning wages are just that fund divided by the number of workers. The text argues against that.
How so?
It highlights writers like Francis Walker and William Thornton who challenged it. The text argues that the amount employers can pay isn't the main driver. Rather, it's the quantity of work that needs doing that determines the demand for labor. Wages then come from the bargaining between employers and workers, influenced by the workers' standard of living and efficiency. Walker's point, which they cite, was that the work dictates the labor demand, not some fixed fund.
And they make that distinction between money wages and real wages.
Oh, absolutely crucial. Money wages are just the dollars and cents. Real wages are what those dollars and cents can actually buy the goods and services. The text argues the permanent level of real wages is heavily influenced by the laborer's standard of living.
Which is?
It's the level of comforts and necessities they consider essential, the level they won't willingly drop below.
How does that connect to population then?
It ties directly back to Malthusian ideas about population checks. If the price of necessities goes up and workers insist on maintaining their standard of living their real wages, they'll demand higher money wages. If employers can't afford that without cutting into profits, it might lead to less employment, or, as the text suggests, a prudential check on population growth, things like delaying marriage, having fewer kids. They even show data from Massachusetts and Vermont on marriage rates to illustrate this. It's a complex feedback loop between economics and social behavior.
The text also talks about why wages are so unequal, why some people earn way more.
It starts with Adam Smith's classic reasons: ease or hardship of the job, trust required, uncertainty of success, cost of learning the trade. But then the text adds a critical point. Often the lowest paid jobs are the hardest.
Right.
So Smith's reasons don't explain the scale of the difference. They emphasize what they call natural monopolies, things like rare skill, exceptional talent, or even just having the means to survive during a long training period without earning. These factors effectively exclude most people from the higher-paying jobs, allowing wages there to rise far beyond just compensating for difficulty.
And they specifically mention women's wages being lower.
Yes, and the text puts it down directly to the limited occupations open to women back then. It meant those few fields became overstocked with labor, driving wages down simply due to supply and demand within those narrow markets.
Now, here's a point that feels really relevant today. The text argues high wages don't necessarily mean high cost of production.
This is a really powerful insight from the text, I think. They make a strong case that a high rate of wages can actually coexist with a low cost of production if labor is highly efficient.
And the U.S. was their example.
The United States was their prime example. They argued higher American money wages compared to, say, Europe, didn't stop U.S. goods from competing because American labor, often using better machinery and organization, was just much more productive. They even provide a table comparing cotton mill labor and costs between 1841 and 1884. It shows money wages went up, but the labor cost per yard of cloth actually went down because of efficiency gains from new machines. The key factor, they stress, isn't the wage rate alone, but the cost of labor, which is basically the wage divided by efficiency.
Okay, moving on to profits. How are they defined and explained?
Profit, according to this text, has two main parts. Interest, the return to the capitalist for saving and investing, their abstinence and compensation for risk. But, and this is a correction they make to mill profit does not include the wages the owner might pay themselves for managing the business.
So manager salary isn't profit.
No, the text calls that high wages of superintendents, basically. High pay for skill, and keeps it separate from the return purely on the capital invested. They do note that, once you account for risk and skill differences, profit rates tend to equalize across different industries over time.
And what determines the actual rate of profit?
The text traces profit back to the capital advanced to labor during production. So the rate of profit ultimately depends on the cost of labor. If real wages rise, what workers can actually buy, or the cost of the necessities that underpin their standard of living goes up, and labor efficiency doesn't increase enough to offset it, then profits have to fall. The text is blunt. A rise of general wages falls on profits. There is no possible alternative. They argue capitalists can't just raise prices to cover a general wage hike because that would require more money in circulation, which is a separate issue.
Okay, and finally, rent. How does rent fit into this distribution puzzle?
Rent, in this classical view from Ricardo and Mill, comes from the law of diminishing returns in agriculture. As you put more labor and capital onto a fixed piece of land, eventually the extra output you get from each additional unit of input starts to shrink.
Right, diminishing returns. So how does that create rent?
Rent is the difference in yield between the really good land, or land farmed cheaply, and the yield on the worst land currently being farmed that's still just profitable enough to cover costs and pay the normal rate of profit. This worst land is sometimes called the no-rent land.
So the owners of the better land.
They don't just make higher profits themselves. Competition among farmers bids away that extra yield, and it gets paid to the landlord as rent. Rent effectively levels the playing field for profit rates across all farmed land, no matter how fertile or well-located it is naturally.
So rent isn't why corn is expensive, it's the other way around.
Exactly. The text really emphasizes this. Rent is not a cause of high prices. It's a result of prices being high enough to make it worth farming the poorer, higher-cost land. The price of grain gets set by the production cost on that marginal, no-rent land. Owners of better land just capture the surplus yield as rent because their costs are lower. They actually point out that Adam Smith sometimes seemed a bit fuzzy on this, occasionally implying rent caused high prices, which this text corrects. They also contrast their view with Henry Carey's idea that poor lands give increasing returns, which they disagree with.
How does progress, like technology, affect all this, especially rent?
This is where the text offers a bit of optimism. While diminishing returns in agriculture tend to push up food costs and squeeze profits as population grows and forces cultivation onto wasteland, other things can fight back. Industrial progress, better transport, they cite huge savings from lower U.S. railway costs for corn and timber, like hundreds of millions save better industrial tools, more efficient government, even better education, making workers more intelligent and trustworthy.
So all these things help.
Yeah, they all tend to lower the cost of producing goods, including food or getting it to market, or just increase overall productivity. This can push back against rising food prices and falling profits. It allows rent on the good land to potentially increase over time as the edge of cultivation moves outward, even while society as a whole benefits from cheaper manufactured goods and a potentially higher average standard of living.
Okay, let's zoom out and look at how countries interact.
Yeah.
How does this 1885 text view international trade? Does it think it's a zero-sum game?
Absolutely not. It completely dismisses the old mercantilist idea, which they say still had influence in their time, like policies restricting colonial manufacturing that one country's gain in trade must be another's loss. They argue very strongly that trade is just based on the division of labor, like within a country, and it's mutually beneficial.
And the core principle driving it is comparative advantage.
Absolutely central. A country doesn't need to be better at making everything than another country have an absolute advantage. It gains by specializing in and exporting the goods where it has the least disadvantage or the greatest advantage compared to making other goods domestically. They use those classic examples. England might be better at both cotton and iron than Sweden, but if England is way better relatively at cotton, and Sweden is relatively less bad at iron compared to making its own cotton, they both win if England makes cotton, Sweden makes iron, and they trade.
Like the U.S. and England with corn.
Yeah, another example they use. Even if the U.S. was absolutely better at growing corn, the gain comes from specializing in what's relatively most efficient for each country to produce and trading for the rest.
And how do these international exchanges actually balance out? How does the money work?
This leads to what they call the law of international values, or the equation of international demand. Basically, the value at which a country's exports swap for its imports is set by reciprocal demand, how much each country wants the other's stuff. The exchange rates and trade flows adjust until, over time, the total value of exports equals the total value of imports. They point to the U.S. trade balance fluctuating around equilibrium, noting how gold shipments just act like any other commodity transfer to settle accounts when needed. They saw this dynamic clearly in U.S. history before the Civil War.
And the mechanism for managing this day-to-day is foreign exchange.
Yes, the buying and selling of claims to foreign money, often handled by brokers. If there's more demand for British pounds in the U.S. than for dollars in Britain, bills of exchange drawn on London will sell at a premium in New York.
A premium means
It signals a balance is due from the U.S. to Britain. If the imbalance gets big enough, it eventually becomes cheaper just to ship physical gold specie than to pay the rising premium on the bills. This gold flow then affects the money supply and prices in both countries, which shifts imports and exports, eventually bringing things back into balance.
they also had an interesting point about a country's own currency depreciating. How does that affect trade?
Yeah, an interesting nuance. A depreciated currency like the greenbacks being worth less than gold doesn't actually stop foreign trade. Trade just carries on based on the underlying metallic values. Foreign traders would just demand more of the depreciated currency to get the same gold value.
But it does affect the exchange rate.
It affects the nominal exchange rate. The par of exchange, the rate based on the face value of coins, rises proportionally to how much the paper currency has depreciated against gold.
Okay, finally, the text looks at government's role, especially through taxes and debt. What are the principles of good taxation according to them?
Well, they draw heavily on Adam Smith here. The key principles are equality, meaning equal sacrifice, proportionate to income or means. Certainty, the tax should be clear, not arbitrary. Convenience paid when and how it's easiest for the taxpayer. And economy, the cost of collecting the tax should be minimal compared to the revenue it brings in.
And how do different taxes actually affect the economy? Who pays?
This is where their historical context really matters. They analyze the incidence where the burden ultimately falls. A tax on wages in a place like the U.S., where they saw wages as above bare subsistence, would likely fall on the worker. But in a country where wages were at subsistence, the tax might either force wages up or just lower the standard of living further.
What about profits?
A tax on profits is seen as bad because it discourages saving and capital accumulation. A tax specifically on ground rent, like on the land itself, not buildings, ultimately falls on the landlord because rent is seen as a surplus from natural advantage, not a cost that determines price.
And taxes on goods, like sales tax or import duties.
Taxes on commodities, excise, or customs duties get criticized pretty heavily. They typically raise prices by more than the tax itself because of added costs and reduced competition. And if they're on necessities, they hit lower-income people hardest. The text strongly argues against taxing necessities and inputs used in production.
What about government debt versus taxation? Which do they prefer?
They really take a dim view of financing things, especially wars, through debt instead of immediate taxes. The argument is that borrowing diverts capital that would have been used productively, employing labor towards unproductive government spending. Plus, it saddles the nation with perpetual interest payments, which they see as a pure drain on wealth, basically taxing future generations for past spending. While they admit some public works benefit the future, they strongly favor paying for things, particularly wasteful things like war, through current taxation. Ideally, taxes that don't hit savings too hard, like succession duties, inheritance taxes.
Wow, okay. We have covered a remarkable amount of ground here, from the very basics of saving and production, through value, money, distribution into wages, profit, rent, and then international trade, government finance, all through the lens of this 1885 textbook.
It really is a comprehensive system they lay out, isn't it? It presents a world where economic laws feel quite, well, deterministic, driven by things like capital's power, labor efficiency, land's diminishing returns, and human behavior like saving and population growth.
And it shows how they saw progress, industrial improvements, better transport, even education,
Yeah.
as these forces that could potentially counteract some of the gloomier tendencies, like profits getting squeezed or living standards stagnating because of those diminishing returns.
Precisely. They suggest that dreaded stationary state where profits get so low nobody wants to invest or accumulate more is only kept at bay by constant improvement and capital finding new productive places to go.
And what about the position of the laborer in all this? The text mentions the increased focus on the working classes back then. It feels like they're hinting that just getting wages isn't the end of the story for workers.
That's right. While just general increases in capital help workers through more jobs and potentially higher pay, the text definitely explores ways laborers might improve their situation beyond just riding that general wave. One path is gaining skills and knowledge to become managers or overseers. Their higher pay is seen not as profit, but as those high wages of superintendents we talked about, basically pay for skill, a kind of natural monopoly.
And the other path,
The other path they highlight is workers combining their own resources into cooperative associations.
did they have real examples of those working?
Yeah, they actually point to successful worker cooperatives in the U.S. at the time, like the Beaver Falls Cooperative Foundry Association. The text describes it being owned and run by the workers. It paid standard market wages, but the key thing was the profits, the surplus, after costs and wages, were shared out among the workers as dividends. They saw this model leading to better production, more care with resources, improved morale, better habits among the workers, at least until outside pressures or internal problems cropped up. It was presented as a real practical way for laborers to potentially capture more of the wealth they helped create by acting collectively and gaining management skills.
Diving into this 1885 textbook, it's just been, well, fascinating. It gives such a clear view of the economic machinery as they understood it back then.
Right.
The central role of capital born from saving, that distinction between productive and unproductive effort, how value comes from cost and demand, and how income gets split according to these seemingly fixed principles, all shaped by population, land, technology.
It really does provide a solid analytical framework, even if some specific models or conclusions have obviously been refined or challenged since then. Understanding this foundation is pretty key to seeing how modern economics developed, I think. It highlights these persistent questions about wealth, growth, fairness, and distribution that, honestly, we still wrestle with today.
It really makes you connect the dots, doesn't it? From over a century ago to now,
Yeah.
so much of the language, the core ideas, feel oddly familiar, even though the world and the economy have changed so dramatically.
Absolutely. And maybe it leaves you with this thought to chew on. If, as this text argues so strongly, high wages can actually be a sign of low labor cost when efficiency is high, what does that fundamental principle suggest about how we should maybe analyze today's debates about wages, productivity, and competitiveness in our very globalized economy?